Thank you so much. I'll make my interventions in English. I wasn't quite sure if Jeremy would be still with us, but he has left now. But this is a global project that we've been working on together with partners in China, India, United States, etc. So all of the stuff is in English, and I thought I might as well continue in that way. Otherwise, great believer in Scandinavian communication and Nordic interaction in our home languages, except Finland, but otherwise, I think it's a good idea. I'm going to talk about this project, the New Climate Economy, which Norway, Sweden, and the UK set up about 2 years ago, which has helped to show the opportunities and the benefits that can come with a transition to a low-carbon economy. It's very closely related to the green growth agenda, which is the theme here. But I think we would like to say that, well, the green growth advocates are sort of talking about this as a utopian future with very little caveats. We say, well, okay, we can see this, but the problem is that we're the only ones who believe it. We have to convince the politicians in the finance ministries, the businessmen in the oil and gas sector, etc. And we have to do this with balanced, dry arguments without normative connotations. So that's what the New Climate Economy report tried to do. The essence of my argument is really in these 4 bullets, that we are facing this deep structural transformation of the world economy. This is what Jeremy talked about, and it will come. But we are also in a decisive period for a low-carbon transition. Will we resolve the climate challenge or not? This is the choice of our generation. I think, on the basis of the platforms and sectors that we've studied in the New Climate Economy, that the Nordic region is uniquely positioned to play a leadership role here, in particular on the new energy supply and demand systems. But that it's nowhere clear what the plan looks like to get there. And if we want to harvest these benefits, it's very many governance challenges and institutional challenges that need to be resolved in business models, in policies, regulations, and in public engagement, for instance. The world today is far from any sort of economic optimum. We know that. Each region around the world is facing dire challenges. Here in the EU and the OECD, we are struggling with what's been called secular stagnation. The productivity is low, the economic growth is low, and seems to be staying at a low level. In many places, the infrastructure is crumbling. We're struggling with inequality that is increasing in social side. China has faced an enormous rapid economic growth based on heavy industry, very polluting growth, and they are now looking to transform their economies in new ways. And the list goes on and on. Middle-income countries, poor countries have their challenges, and many of the low-carbon strategies are able to address many of the challenges that we see here. We've been in the Nordic region, I think, front runners for a couple of decades. And it's a good question to ask, have we suffered a lot from doing green policies and climate policies over these 2 last decades? Now you see here the environmental performance score of the Yale Environmental Performance Index against GDP per capita. And you see the shape, and you see where the Nordic countries are clustered with a high performance on environmental side and a relatively high GDP per capita. The pattern is, of course, even more clear when you look at the global picture. So the Swedish and Norwegian and Finnish economies are on the far right. Would we have been all the way over here if we had not taken care of the environment, if we had low environmental performance? It seems unlikely somehow that we would be outliers at that corner of the diagram. And if you look at other indicators, this is just from Sweden, but all the conventional indicators of GDP growth, productivity growth, the public sector debt, unemployment, we outperformed the EU in general over the last 20 years. So it seems like this development so far has served us quite well. This is a messy compilation of different indices that are very popular to compile nowadays. And you see the competitiveness index that is provided by the World Economic Forum, the Global Innovation Index, you have the Environmental Performance Index, and the quite newly constructed Global Green Economy Index there in the middle. It's the same countries that come up over and over again in these indices. You are top competitive, top innovation, top environmental performer. There is something that seems to suggest that these things go together. Now the question is not if it's a correlation, cause effect. The question is that yes, we can do it at the same time. But in the end, you know, if you do micro-level analysis and you look at employment, exports, etc., it can be difficult to attribute those impacts to specific low-carbon policies or climate policies. But this mostly because these factors are controlled by so many other important factors, labor market rules or other conditions for industry, for instance. And the question now is, of course, this is from the IPCC, how do we get to the safe 2-degree pathway? Because we're only just scratching the surface of the transition that needs to happen. And industry is asking themselves, well, maybe we've already covered the low-hanging fruits. Maybe there's much, much more costly interventions that will be required to take us further down this route. And we are globally not on track for the blue segment here, but we are heading for a 4-degree world. But there is reason for optimism. And the way that the exponential capacity enhancement and growth in the new technologies have developed over the last 30 years is an example of this. Wind turbines showed on this map how much larger capacity has been over these years. The cost of solar PV and a development that nobody had expected. You're now seeing auction bids in across India, China, the US, South Africa, where bids around 60 to $100 per megawatt hour for solar, which is on par with utilities from new coal plants, for instance. So we are constantly underestimating this power innovation and getting down these learning curves. And here, a pertinent example from Norway. This is a new analysis that we've done and will be coming out in a couple of weeks, looking at the rapidly falling battery costs for electric vehicles. So we're reaching a kind of a performance and cost level of these batteries that engineers just 10, 15 years ago said was theoretically impossible. So the power innovation here. And now in the new Tesla factory that's being built, they are aiming to produce the batteries at $100 per kilowatt hour. So reaching below the red line there, or the pink area where battery electric vehicles will be fully commercially competitive with the internal combustion engine. And of course here Norway has been taking the helm and helped to pay for the learning curve so far and providing a lead market, which I think is serving you well, but also serving the world a big service. So this is the kind of exponentiality that we're seeing across these systems. And I think the policy system and the incumbent businesses have difficulty grasping this exponentiality. And all of us had difficulties seeing it. But some years, the solar panels are dropping 25% on an individual year. So what's happening on the other side of the energy supply system? Well, globally, this is mostly a story about coal, actually. Not so much here in the Nordic region, but you have this, the equation for coal is starting to look more and more problematic. So both China and India are moving from largely self-sufficient system to extreme import dependence. Now, it's still cheap, but it has an energy security dimension that they are very, very concerned about. And of course, it's very polluting. Air pollution in China now becoming one of the major political issues, threatening the political stability for the leadership in China. So all the major cities in China are seeing that or you could say not seeing the sun anymore because of particle concentrations in the air. And the premier leadership is really seeing this as this is nature's red light warning, and we have to do something about it. So they have chosen path, and they are trying to massively reform their entire economy to a more service-based, light commercial economy instead of heavy industry-based economy. I shouldn't talk too much about oil in this. I don't know anything about oil and gas, but you can see the volatility in this market, of course. That's going up again today, but is this a robust foundation for the Norwegian economy in the long term? Or how can we hedge our bets in diversifying this? In the new climate economy, we also took a big interest in cities and urban systems. And it's also a story that maybe is more relevant in other parts of the world, but the sprawling infrastructures of many parts of the world and the carbon footprint that comes with it. So here you have a comparison between Atlanta and Barcelona, very comparable cities in terms of population and economies, but with enormously much higher carbon footprints in Atlanta. This is a sort of a graphical example, but you can see that if you take a big sample of cities, you see a very clear pattern emerging. So the third leg in the new climate economy report is land use and agricultural systems, and I won't touch upon that here today. I think the smart urban systems and the energy system, energy supply and distribution system are two of the backbones that will be of particular importance for this conference. So we're looking at these technology transitions, and they have been outlined in many reports over the years, and we know the pathways. It's the Nordic energy technology perspectives, it's the roadmap, European 2050, etc. It's renewable energy generation and distribution, it's electrification of transport, it's also electrification of industries to some degree, and it's smart and connected urban systems. But we haven't really done enough evidence searching, research, and policy analysis on how you implement these and the major challenges. And I think we need to address, in particular, these 4 bullets are, I think, good topics for discussion. The new business models. How can companies make money and revenue in these new systems when you have, for instance, zero marginal cost in the energy market, in the electricity market? Who is going to finance these investments, and what are the new mechanisms needed for financing? For instance, we're facing zero marginal cost, but I don't particularly agree with Jeremy that also the fixed cost will go down to zero. In fact, we have very big upfront investment and then much lower marginal cost. But we need changes in investment mechanisms so that we can reduce the capital cost of those investments. But we need also consumer engagement and consumers becoming prosumers when it comes to electricity generation, when it comes to storage, when it comes to demand response in the energy system. And so this also needs to be tackled with policy reform and policy for innovation at the appropriate scales through, for instance, creating niche markets, lead markets, maybe public procurements or constructed markets, such as the certificate system, which we have jointly now between Sweden and Norway for renewable electricity. But our global analysis shows that although infrastructure capital will have to be larger in these low-carbon scenario, it's actually quite a small difference. So you see the base case in the red part of the diagram with $89 trillion and 93 for the low carbon alternative. And that these investments are actually offset by avoided operating and financial costs, because basically you're saving on the marginal cost on the fuels when you move to these systems, which are more upfront investment, even taking into account stranded assets. We are not alone, and it's maybe not always known how the growth of carbon pricing is coming everywhere in the world. And let me see, we now have, I think, 39 national and 23 subnational jurisdictions that have implemented or are scheduled to implement the carbon pricing scheme. China has introduced the world's second largest carbon market after the EU. So it's really happening. And it's not that we are putting a major constraint on our economies in terms of the global competition with this carbon pricing. The question is now, can we create a Nordic lead market here? And is for instance, is the Nordic countries or Norway in pole position here? And I think we are. I think in the Nordic setting, we have all the strategies and the platforms we need to get going. We have both Norway and Denmark being pioneers on smart grids and smart city solutions with live learning laboratories such as Bornholm. We have a virtually carbon-free power system with a fantastic balancing possibility through the Norwegian and partly Swedish hydropower system. Norway has taken the lead on electric transport. And to top it all up, we have all the biofuels and biomass we need if we want to make some thermal energy systems working also on renewables. But today it's not really happening, and there's an ambiguity. There's not a political signal at the Nordic level or at the Swedish level. I'm not sure about the Norwegian politics here, but I'll be interested to learn more over the coming days where you are on climate policy. This creates investor uncertainty, and it's creating costs for businesses. But we already see that incumbents are struggling to deal with the new reality of the new energy market. But at the same time, the new companies, the startups, and the new actors coming in are also struggling because the signal is very difficult to predict. So now is the time to act, and we can maximize flexibility, and we can reduce the lock-in, and we can reduce asset stranding. The investments made in fossil sectors may have to run their course, but be careful with the new investments that will last for 30, 40 years. There are many frontline technology options available, and we have in the Nordic region this regional political and economic integration, which creates a lead market big enough to be a platform for innovation. So this work is sort of the basis from this Global Commission on the Economy and Climate and the new Climate Economy report. You see the web page there and the partnership that has been involved in developing the work. My hope now is that we can move towards a Nordic new climate economy. And Marianne and Asker, I hope you apologize for this advertisement, but we're putting together a research consortium with NTNU here in Trondheim, Cicero in Oslo, DTU in Copenhagen, VTT in Finland, to look at how can we deal with these implementation challenges in the low-carbon transition for the Nordic region. And so this will be an application that goes into the Nordic energy research based here in Norway. Thank you very much.
Tusen takk.